All right, so we've been going over the React State Abbreviator challenge from yesterday. So this was, again, just a pretty simple app to kind of just get us comfortable with creating a React app from scratch, creating some components, and then using state and prop values to appropriately communicate between those components. So let's get into it. Let's kind of read the high level. Again, there's not too much information on our README page. Basically, we want to create an app. So we need to run create React app. That's something I've already done. So I got my project started already. Got my happy hacking message, which means my create React app worked correctly. I named my app USA-app. So that's what my application's named. Looking in this project, just kind of go over some of the files that we will encounter with our React app. Again, we have three main folders. We have the node modules folder, which has all of our libraries that got downloaded with create React app running. That has, again, dozens and dozens of libraries. I don't even know half of them which are in there, but I don't need to worry about it. That's what React needs there to work properly. We also have a public folder. Again, there's not much in here. The main key point of interest is index.html. That is our main web page for our project, but we don't need to modify that either. We're not going to be writing HTML here. We're going to be interacting with React, which is primarily JavaScript. It all boils down to JavaScript in the end. So we have index.js, which is our main entry point for our React app. Notice that we are rendering an app component, but we do not generally need to modify this file either. Again, this is how we launch a React app with this app component. And this gets rendered, and then that's where we start adding our logic. So by default, we have this like spinning icon. If I run npm start, that should launch my server, and I am not in the right directory. I do that pretty much all the time. So I need to get into USA app and then do npm start. So just to be clear, this command of start is looking in our package.json. So if you remember, we talked about package.json a bit yesterday. There's a bunch of data in here. The scripts section has a few options in here. So you can run npm start, build, test, or eject. It's going to run these particular commands for us. So it's actually running React scripts start. It's what's being launched here. So npm start, we'll start our React server. Andrew Tran, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, in your index where it runs like app slash, the one you just showed us, like the render thing. My question is, does that run the function or does it run the entire app.js file?
So that's going to run the function. So it's basically going to call into our app.js app function, and it's going to render whatever is being returned from this function. So it's not repeatedly calling this file every time. It's just calling this function each time it needs to render the app component. Yep, good question. So yeah, whatever we return out of our component is what is going to be thrown onto the screen through whatever conversions that need to be done. But this is JSX, to be clear. This is not HTML. This is JSX that gets boiled down to JavaScript, and that JavaScript eventually adds items to your DOM so that you actually see it on your browser or in your browser. So, all right, so we launched our server. Again, your terminal should have information. So if you have any errors, you'll see them down here. Ideally, you want to see, all right, you can view your USA app, whatever location. So the default port is 3000. So if I go to 3000. All right, so again, this is the default React page. If you get to this point, that means everything you've set up correctly. But we don't want to get hypnotized by this icon. We want to add our own logic. So I'm going to go to app.js and just delete everything inside my render. I'm going to keep my div. The reason I keep my div is because it has a class name, and this uses some CSS styling. And I just want to retain that styling. So I'm just going to keep that div around. All right, so if we write a simple, let's go with a header tag. So I'm just going to go H2. I feel like H1 is kind of too prominent for me. So we have an H2 tag, and let's call this our state abbreviation. Terrible with spelling. All right, so state abbreviation app. I'm a huge fan of horizontal rules. So I'm going to add an HR element. All right, so again, adding some HTML elements to our JSX. That is, we could add HTML elements. We could add other React components to our render method. We can also add JavaScript. If I add, curly braces here, this is going to be JavaScript that's going to do some logic for us. But I don't need that right now. So let's just see what our app looks like right now. So I have an H2 and an HR. So there we go. There's my simple application that doesn't do anything yet, but it has a nice title. So I'm kind of happy about that. All right, but obviously want to add some functionality here. So yeah, let's take a look at what we need to do for this challenge. So if I go back to the README, sorry, I just want to bring my terminal up. All right, the README. So we created our base app. We want to move the static state data directory in the root into the source folder, right? So that's something I've not done. Code outside of the source folder is not compiled. That's good to know. All right, and then we want to import the state data from state data / index.js and use it to construct a UI. So we must have a dropdown and a component that displays abbreviation. All right, so we can kind of get that started. So I need to take the state data folder and drop that into my source folder. So I'm going to grab that, drop this here. All right, so we have in our source folder state data. We relocated that file. We have index.js. Always good to know what type of data you're working with. So always inspect your data. All right, so looking at this, it looks like it's an array, right? We have square brackets, and then each element looks like it's a object. I always want to say dictionary because I prefer that term. That's a Python term. This is an object, also known as a dictionary, where you have key value pairs. So it looks like we have a name, the name of the state, and then we have alpha2, which is the abbreviation for each state. So it looks like that is, hopefully have 50 states here. I don't think we've added any in recent past. Looks like there's a typo for Kansas. That's the first time I'm noticing it, so I'll fix that. Louisiana.
There's one, yeah, that was the one I was gonna say.
Louisiana, is that misspelled?
Yeah, you need an I.
Yeah, yeah. I always good to spot those errors. I'm not sure why those letters are missing. All right, cool. We corrected our data. Good to make sure the data is correct before we use it. All right, so that's what we have. Looks like we also have DC here. That's, I guess they could be our 51st state sometime. All right, so our data looks like that. We'll use that in a bit. Well, let's get our UI just working, and no wires connecting, just what our UI should look like. So it said we need a dropdown. Now, let's say I don't know how to do a dropdown HTML. We could quickly Google that. Dropdown HTML. I think there's a good W3 schools page. Yep, I've clicked on this before. So again, we need to use a select element. And that's something I use very often. And then we have a bunch of options that are going to be populated in that dropdown. So right now we just need a select element. So we can do that pretty easily. Let's do this all in app.js right now, and we'll break it out to components later. If you guys are fine with that. So we need select, name, and ID. Okay. Let's just do a select statement and see what that looks like. All right, so we have this dropdown. Obviously, there's nothing in it. So let's add some dummy data right now. So we'll do option value equals donuts. And then we want text. So this is what the user sees. And this is what your selection will pass back to you. So again, this value does not need to match the text. I could have donuts be value 1. And usually these are going to be IDs, not all the time, but usually these are going to be like internal representation of your data versus user friendly representation of your data. So I might have, a bunch of food items with IDs and their text values. So let's see what donuts looks like. There we go. We got donuts. We need more options. Let's add a couple more options. I think we have bagel fans in the audience, so maybe we'll do bagels. Bagels, and then is there a third option between donuts and bagels that are like the same shape? Cronuts, are those? I don't know. Both cronuts.
E-rings.
E-rings? Is that a thing?
Yeah, like a peach ring. That's the only thing I can think of that's like a circular disc with a hole in it.
All right, you got to spell that for me.
It's just peach ring.
Peach ring. Gotcha. Sorry, I misheard you the first time. Peach ring. All right, cool. So we have peach ring. These are our options. Cool. All right, so it looks like our selector works. Obviously, it's not doing anything. It's just selecting an item. That's kind of cool. A nice HTML element that we can use. All right, so we got our dropdown sort of working. Obviously, not with real data. What else? So we have our selects. What else do we need based on our requirements? We need a component that displays the abbreviation. Again, so that can be any textual element, could be a header, could be a paragraph, could be a div, take your pick. I think we want to show this in a header, make this really prominent. So I'm gonna go with, actually, I'm gonna go with div. Sorry, I'm gonna give this an ID and say, call this div state ABBR. The reason I want to give this an ID is because I want to make this really prominent. Like this is the main data I'm showing. So I'm going to give this some CSS styling if you guys don't mind. I know this isn't required, but I'm going to go to app.css. Again, this is the main CSS file for our app component, and everything below app will also use the same CSS styling. So you don't need to create a new CSS style or a new CSS file for each component you create. You can, but know that everything in app.css will trickle down to any other component that you create within app. So here, if I go to app.css, let's add a quick style just to get some practice with CSS in case you guys forgot it. Since I created an ID, right? I have an ID here. To select it, I need to use hashtag. So the hashtag symbol, and then my div was div/state ABBR. And to make this font really gigantic, so I'm going to go with font size. What's a good size? Let's go with 64 pixels. And let's colorize this. So let's go with color. Take a random color from this. Let's go with medium orchid. I like the sound of that. So save that. And then we want to add some dummy data. So we'll say, I'm in Michigan right now, so I'll put MI because that'll be the abbreviation for it. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Another thing I want to point out here, your terminal is going to be giving you any warnings. So always pay attention to your terminal. Sometimes warnings are fine, as in your application usually will work, but always good to clean up those warnings if you can. So looking here, it says logo is defined but never used. All right, that's good to know. Maybe I made a mistake and wanted to use logo. Maybe I don't need to incorporate logo into my app component. It looks like I deleted the logo. That was the React logo that was spinning. Don't need that, so I'm going to delete that. In fact, delete from my project because I don't want that around. Okay. All right, so we have this div that is using some CSS styling that we targeted based on the ID. We're just showing the abbreviation of the random states. So it looks like I don't have any warnings in my terminal. That's always good to see. There we go. So this is state abbreviation. Again, it has no connection to my dropdown right now. I could select any food item. It's not going to change anything. But okay, so I think we have our initial layout or UI established, right? We have all of our controls that we need. We might need more. I can't really think of anything right now. But we have our UI going. So that was, again, pretty quick to do with React. So that's one of the benefits of React. It's easy to get a UI up and going. What else? Let's make this font. Sorry, I care about styling too much, so probably shouldn't waste time on this, but I want to make it nice and bold. Okay, so now we have our layout. What do we need to do next? Now we need to add those wires, actually add some logic. I think one thing that we saw in release, we need to actually use the state data. So maybe that's the first thing I want to do. I want to actually use the real data I have instead of just using some dummy data for my dropdown. So let's tackle that next. All right, so we need to get this data, import it into our app. So to do that, I can do, go to app.js. And we should be able to import, again, this is a JS file. So we should be able to just import it like any other JS file. So in my app, I'm going to do import state, say USA state. I don't want to confuse this with like state values in React, but USA state data from, and we got to find that file. So it's in the current level / state data / index.js. I think we should probably rename that to like data.js because index.js exists somewhere else. I'm going to do that stuff. Hopefully you guys are fine with it. I don't want two index.js's to be loitering around. So I'm going to rename this to data.js just for my mindset right here. So I have data.js, not index.js, which is a different file. I'm going to import that. So I'm going to import that into USA state data. And now I could use this just like a data structure that I created here. So again, this was an array of objects. That's what I'm importing into my app.js. I have an array of objects in this item right here. So we export it from this file and import it into here. So we have that data structure. Now we need to populate this control with the data. How do we go about doing that? Any ideas? So this is static data. So we do not need to create a state value in our app. So we talked about state values yesterday. We want to create state values. Let's add comments. Create these when the data impacts, let's say.
Could you just loop through it?
What was that, Lyman?
Could you just loop through it? Since it's static data, you said it's a list of.
Yeah, it's a list of dictionaries. So we don't need to create a state value here. This is going to be constant. So our render, whenever it renders, is going to use this data. And we know this data is not going to change. So we don't need to create an internal state value.
So can we do a for loop? Or just do a for loop through it, and then we can inject the JSX into the select.
Absolutely. Yep. We're going to add some JavaScript in this portion. So I just want to be clear here. So we do not need a state value for this data because this data is not going to be changing. If you had data like some variables or some data that's going to be changing and that impacts how your component renders, then that is when you need to create state value. So in this case, we do not. This is data that's not changing. So we could just use it without creating state values here. So as Lyman was mentioning, I want to do some for loop over this data and use that to populate our items here. Now, my rule of thumb, again, this is just recommendation. Don't make your render too complicated. I could try to add a lot more logic here. I'm just going to create a new function. There's nothing stopping me from creating a JavaScript function and just calling that function from my main return method. So here I'm going to create a new method and call it const populate state dropdown. I'm not always the best with naming, but hopefully that's a good enough name. So this will populate all of these elements, right? So I'm going to copy that hard-coded chunk out, add some JavaScript here. So again, curly braces, we could call JavaScript from here. I'm going to call populate dropdown. In this case, we do want the parentheses here. If you remember, this means it's going to call immediately, as in when it's running this code, it's going to call this function immediately, which is what we want in this case. Usually for event handlers, we don't want to call a function right away. We want the event when it's triggered to then call our function. So that is a case where you will not use parentheses. But in this case, this is not an event. We just want to do something right away when we're rendering. So we call that function here, and whatever we return from here will be basically inserted in this section. So we have our data up here. So I think Lyman suggested a for loop. That sounds delicious to me. So I'll go for let's I equals 0, I less than USA state data dot length. Again, that's just an array, even though I kind of named it in atypical fashion. It's just an array, I plus plus. All right, and so we want to return JSX, return JSX. So I'm going to create an array to store my JSX elements. I'm going to call it elements. That's my default naming. That's going to be an empty array. So our goal here is to go through our JavaScript data and create JSX elements that we want to show right here. So if you remember, we're creating those select elements. That's what I'm going to do in my for loop. I'm going to say elements dot push. And I want to push select elements. So this is where I'm actually writing JSX right here. Select, and then we need a value for each of them. And then we also need the text. So we have USA state data at index I, because that's where their iterating variable is. So we get that. What is I? If you guys remember, the item at index I, if I still have my data up here, this is going to be this entire dictionary or object. I keep saying dictionary. Hope you guys are fine with that. It's going to be this entire object, which has 2 entries, 2 key value pairs. So I want to show the user the state name, right? So I need to access name from that object. So I could just do another square brackets, or I could do a dot operator. So take or pick. We could do dot name. Oops. We do dot name, or we do square brackets name. Either one should work. I'll go with square brackets this time. All right, so that should show us the full state name, but we want to also know what, I guess, what key this is, or the abbreviation for it. So in this case, maybe I want to store this value. So I'm not going to even use the key here. I'm going to, or I guess I'm going to use the key to get the value. So I'm going to store this as the value and this as the user text that the user sees. So now I have the abbreviation stored in the dropdown based on what they select. All right, so I'm going to use @alpha2, which is the key, to store the value. So the value here will be the same thing I have here. Again, always understand what your data structures are dealing with. So in this case, I need alpha2. But again, this is not literally what I want. I don't want this string. I want the actual value. That's why I need to use curly braces here. I want this to be evaluated. I mean, give me back the 2-letter abbreviation. So again, this is a string. I want to use the JavaScript value that I get back. So this will return a string back for me and set that as the value. Any questions about anything I've done so far? I feel like I've been going strong without any questions.
Could you repeat what you just did?
What I just did. So I'm trying to extract data or my values out of here. So this is what I want to show to the user. And this is what I want to store inside of that select element. So that when the user selects Alabama, I know that the equivalent of that is AL for the abbreviation. So I'm storing this as the value on the select object or the element. And this is the displayed content for that select element. The last thing I talked about was I don't want to put this just as string. If I put this just as string, this is the literal text that is stored when they select Alabama. Like this will be Alabama. This is a literal string that will be returned to me. This is not what I want, right? I want to, let me screw this up. I want this to be evaluated in JavaScript because this is a list that will, and then this is a dictionary. So this will give me back the value that's at this key. So again, a lot of data structures we're going through. This is our array. This is going to give us a dictionary, and this is going to give us the value at that key in that dictionary or object, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
John Price.
Yes, did you rename the array of objects in the data.js to be US state data?
So I didn't rename anything in this file. The only thing I renamed here was the actual file because I didn't like the name index.js. So I renamed this to data.js. The way I get access to it is I import it in app.js and I give it a name right here. This is like creating a new variable almost. Like, again, if you want to imagine this, I'm doing a let USA state data equals an array that has objects in it. This is where I'm getting back from the file and I'm just assigning it to a variable. But in this case, we need to import it because it's stored somewhere else.
React just knows that you're referring to that because it's the only array in that file.
Yep, because that's what we're exporting. So again, exports and imports, I know it gets kind of confusing, but this is the only thing we're exporting from this file is this entire thing. That's what export default is saying is this is the only thing being exported.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right, so that's what we get back. So we get this array of objects in USA state data, and then we're able to iterate through it. Ivan, you have a question?
Yeah, is it just a personal choice of using a for loop instead of a map? Like, is a map just like sloppy when it comes to like someone else coming to my code?
Nope, maps are actually great, and that's something that we're going to cover a bit later today. So I know we talked about array methods way back when, probably in week 1. Definitely using map and filter and ternary statements, definitely more prevalent in React. So we'll see kind of why those are more beneficial. They slim down your code a lot, actually. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I just want to make sure we're just using for loops. So maps are using the map functions a little more could be more confusing. So I just want to keep it simple right now. But yeah, great suggestion. We'll convert that to map hopefully at the end of this. All right. So we have our select statements. We're pushing them into elements. We need to return elements from here. All right. So always a good stopping point to check, make sure this actually works correctly. So I'm going to save this file. Make sure I double check my code. All right, we create an array, we push into that, return that array. Again, there's some magic going on here. This array gets converted to individual JSX elements. So we're returning an array here, but it's not an array on this side. It's just individual elements. I know that's some arbitrary magic, but that's what's going on. All right, so let's take a look if this is working. It looks like I have some warnings. So I want to look at those. Assign array to a variable before exporting as module default. I've seen this warning before. I'm gonna ignore this warning because I don't want to deal with it, but hopefully my code still works. So refresh here. All right, got nothing there. That's not good. Let's make sure I have USA state data. So let's print that out. Console.
Did those select tags on line 15 need to be option tags?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Always hard to talk and type. Yes, these need to be option tags. Thank you, Marcos. That would have taken me probably an hour to figure out. Yeah, we want to return option tags, not a select tag. Select tag is the dropdown. Option elements are the actual choices within that dropdown. Thanks, Marcos. All right. Hopefully that was the only issue. All right, there we go. Thanks. All right, so we have all of our states populated. Hopefully there's 50. I guess we have 51 if DC is in here. Yeah, DC is in here. So, all right, now we're able to select items. So I can select California, Idaho, and the state. This updates, right? But my abbreviation is not changing because we've not wired that into any functionality, right? This is hard coded, but now we have this data kind of coming from our data file. So that's kind of cool. All right, so let's proceed on from here. Again, we're making slow and steady progress, always testing incrementally. Any questions up to this point? I want to make sure we're not rushing this. Okay, so again, in my render, I am calling into a function, which is fine. That function is going to return JSX and basically insert that JSX between my two select statements or my select tags. All right, so the next thing we need to do is, well, we don't want to hard code abbreviation right here, right? We want to show something that's dynamic based on the user select something. We want to respond to that and then show the abbreviation here. So this is where events come into play, right? An event is happening when the user selects something. When they select Pennsylvania, that is an event that's generated. Right now, we're just ignoring that event. We're not doing anything with it. But we want to capture that event and respond to it. So that's why we want to create an event handler and have that event handler called when this particular event happens, which is selecting something from the dropdown. Jesse, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was trying to follow along with you, and I keep getting this error about node modules doesn't exist. Do you know anything about how that works?
Make sure you have your node modules folder and make sure you're on the right level of your directory. One thing I can say, and double check this, we may need to take this offline, but make sure you don't have two different package.jsons. I know this has happened to me. I've seen it happen to students where if you do an npm like install or create React app on the wrong level, you might wind up with two different package.jsons and create two different node modules. That's my best guess right now, but might need to take this offline.
All right, thanks.
Yep. All right, so we got our drop down. We need to respond to the events, right? So events being generated when they select something, we want to respond to it. So how do we respond to that event? This is where, again, Googling comes into play. So if I don't know how to handle that event, we could do a quick Google, see if this page has it. All right, let's say, what event is generated for HTML select? All right, so it looks like there's an on select event that maybe we want to use. What else do we have? Stack Overflow. Okay, it looks like there's an on change maybe. Let's see what they say. Yeah, it looks like on change is the way to go. I'm not sure if on select is a legit one, but on change is what I'm familiar with. So basically, when the user changes something, there's a change event that gets fired. So this is changing. So we need to hook into that event. So the way to do that, we need to specify the event attribute in our select element right here. So this dropdown, when it's changing, it's going to send an event somewhere. So we're going to tap into that by hooking to on change. And then telling that who's going to handle this event. So this is the event handler we need to put right here. So let's create an event handler for this. I'm going to say event handlers, going to organize my code. And let's create a new function. Let's say on select state. All right, so when they select a state value, we're going to get an event object. So remember, this is automatically passed to us. This is the first argument that we pass to any of our event handlers when we hook them into any of the event attributes. So here we're going to get an event object. If we want to use it, let's call, so on state, select state. And this is the thing I was talking about before. In this case, we do not want to have parentheses because we do not want to call this function right now, as in when this renders, this function should not be called right away. This function should only be called when this event happens, when the change event happens. So I'm not going to add parentheses here because this function will be called on my behalf whenever this event happens. All right, so make sure you understand the distinction of when you need to add parentheses and when you want to omit those parentheses for a function. If there's any confusion about that, please make sure we ask any follow-up questions. Okay, so something changes, our event handler will be called. We want to know what changed. Right, so in this case, we're going to get an event. We want to figure out what they selected. So let's just do a console log and make sure we are properly getting the data out of this event object. We could even try debugging. I know we haven't done debugging yet, so let's try our luck at debugging. So maybe I'll just do EBT, console log, EBT. So we could try putting a breakpoint. I think I remember how to do this. I'm going to go to the run menu, run our index.html. See if this works. I forget if I need to set anything else up. All right, I might need to refresh myself on how to debug. There's a way to debug. App.js. All right, so let's see if I actually select something. If that happens. Yeah, that's not gonna work. All right, I'll figure it out over break. But there's a way to debug. I'm gonna put a pin on that. But we could console log it and see what our event object looks like. That's simple enough. So if I bring up my property inspector, looks like I got a bunch of warnings. That's not good. You provide a value prop to a form field without an on change handler. This will render a read-only field. Hopefully that's gone. All right, so this was the message I think Sukdev was talking about. So you'll likely see this. Each child in a list should have a unique key property. This is just saying when you have like a for loop generating a bunch of elements, each one of those needs to have a unique identifier. So this key property is something I should add, and I definitely forgot about it. So here, I need to figure out how to get some unique value for each of these option tags. And the story behind that, if you guys are interested, is because when React, as we talked about, has a diffing algorithm, when something changes on your screen, React will only update that portion. So in this case, React uses this key to determine, all right, let's say we had a list of 5 items. We had like item 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's say item 3 went from position 3 to the bottom of the list. Let's say we, for some reason, resorted that list. Well, React would know that only item 3 is the one that kind of needs to be updated based on the key. Otherwise, if we just had a list of 5 items, React is not smart enough to know, all right, well, these 5 items have not changed, or these 4 items have not changed. Does that kind of make sense? I'm not sure if I just that properly. So let's say we had our page of 5 items. All right, so imagine this is a list on a HTML page. We had item A, B, C, D, and E. Let's say for whatever reason, our logic needed to move item C to the very bottom here. So now all of our elements will shift up. In this case, React is not going to know like, hey, only this got relocated. I don't need to re-render D and E. Unless we tell like React how to identify each one of these elements. That's what the key property does. If we assign a key for A, B, C, D, and E, React will know, all right, well, A is the same, B is the same, D and E are the same also. I don't need to redraw them. I just need to kind of fill in the space and move C over here. So that's why React wants to know how to identify these kind of uniquely. So it knows what it needs to redraw on the screen and what it can just kind of reuse and kind of relocate. I don't know if that clears anything up, but short story is we need to provide a unique key here, which is like an ID. So we could have an ID field, but React wants to look into the key. So let's just do the value of I and maybe string interpolate. I'll say state I. All right, so hopefully that can take away that warning if I have a unique key for each of these items. Let's refresh our page. All right, cool. No warnings. That makes me a little happier. But now let's actually select a state. So I'm going to select Kansas. All right, notice we're printing out our events. So this is what the synthetic base event is showing us. So if we kind of inspect that, this is what I wanted to do in my debugging view, but I need to figure out how to debug. So this is all the data that we have. Current target is null. This is not correct, but there's a target element. So I can look into the target and see all the options. So I have 51 options, I think, or 50 options. Oh, there's, okay, index 0, so we have 51 options. We're going to have to figure out which one we actually selected, right? So if we try to figure that out. So current target, I know this is I don't think it's a bug, but I've read about this, that this is not actually null. It's shown as null here, but if I actually print it out, evt.current target, I want to say that should let us do something. Well, let's actually do it this way. Let's say if evt.current target, then console log current target is not null. Let's see if this does it. I know there's a weird thing in browsers. So if this is not null, I'll get into the if statement, and then it's going to print out what I want. So let's see if that clears anything up. Refresh. Select Hawaii. All right. So again, current target is not actually null. This is a weird quirk, and I've read about it online. I don't remember the exact peculiarities of it, but notice that I'm able to actually print out the actual control. So this is my select control, and these are all the options in it. Any questions about what I just mentioned there? Andrew Tran.
I just have a quick comment that I had a lot of trouble on. So I used the on select, not the whichever one you're using.
Okay.
And like if you do on select, it returns you have to like it gives you two values back, and it expects an event key and event. And if you're only accessing event key, it's gonna do what you currently say, where it's just gonna say it's null. But the actual event is in the second thing.
Okay, so you said you use the on select right here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did on select, and like you have to like you have to like give it back like two things to put the values into, and it just did the same thing you did, where like the first one was always no.
Okay. Yeah, I guess there's two different items we could, or events we could tap into. Yeah, I guess I'll need to look into on select, but on change should do it also, I think. So we do get the current target. So this is the control that is responding to the event. And then we want to figure out what item is actually selected in there. So to do that, we need to figure out what is actually selected in our control here. So if we get that, we need to figure out what the values of this control. So this is just like an input control, right? So input controls, you type in some text. To get that text out of that control, you do dot value. It's the same case for dropdowns. This is like I'm typing in Missouri, but it's actually a dropdown. So I could do event.currentTarget.value, and it should show me the value of the item that was selected. So again, the value portion of my control, this is the 2-letter abbreviation. That is what dot value should refer to based on what I select from the dropdown. As Andrew Tran said, you could also use on select. I'm not sure what that would particularly change in here. But yeah, there's different events, I guess, that also gets generated from select an item. But let's try it this way. So I want to see, this should be the 2-letter abbreviation for the state that I select in my console. So if I go clear my console. Let's select a few states. Let's go with Oregon, great state out west. All right, there we go. So Oregon, OR, I think that's correct. Let's go with Washington. All right, just hit up the Pacific Coast, got WA. Complete that with hitting up California. There we go. All right, so these look correct. Again, this is just coming from our static data that we set in there. So we were able to figure out the acronym, or not acronym, the abbreviation for the state. So that's working well. The last thing we need to do is tap into this control and tell this control to actually show us what we are selecting. Anyone have an idea on how I could achieve that? So, we have the value right here. How can I show this value down here? So I don't want to show just MI all the time. I want to show this value. Any ideas?
You could create a state.
Absolutely. This is where we do want to create a state value, because this is going to be a value that's changing. And based on that, our render needs to be updated. And so that's the whole reason why we have state values, so that we tell React, hey, manage this value. Whenever this value updates, please re-render our component for us. So in this case, let's create a state value. I think that was Marcos. Thank you for that suggestion. So we need to create a state value. If you remember, we need to import a handy dandy function called useState from React. All right, and now we want to use this function to create a state value. The syntax for that is usually you want to create a const list of 2 items. The first item is going to be your variable that you want to use, your state variable. So I'm going to call this state ABVR. And then your second value that gets returned is a function. You can name this function whatever you want, but by kind of tradition, best name it set, and then the name of your state value that you're going to set. So we're going to call this set state ABBR, or abbreviation. And then you want to call use state and then set that to an initial value. So whatever I pass in this parentheses is the initial value for this variable. I could leave this empty, that's going to be undefined. I can make this null, but I think empty string works for me because it's going to be a string most of the time anyway. So I'm just going to default that to be empty string. And then I have my value here. So let's say I don't want a console log anymore. Get rid of that. Say print out the selected states. All right, and then we can set this, update our internal state value. So I'm going to do set state abbreviation. So again, this is a function that gets returned from useState, and I can call that to update my value. So if I do EVT at current target value, that should set my new state abbreviation. And the only thing I needed down here is just simply show that state abbreviation. So I'm going to say state ABBR. So this is just my state value. I'm just showing it as is. Right, that's my state value. Whenever I update it, again, this is asynchronous. So I'm asking React, hey, could you please update the value of state abbreviation for me? React's to me like, all right, I'll do this when I'm good and ready. I'm not going to do this right now. So if I did console log right here, this is again going to be the old state abbreviation value. This does not take effect immediately, meaning this is going to lag behind, lags behind by 1 selection. Okay, so let's see this in motion. So refresh my app. Let's go with Nevada. Okay, I believe that is the state abbreviation for Nevada. That printed out Nevada. That's curious, Oregon. All right, so where's this one coming from? Oh, because you're printing it out right here. Let me get rid of that to see this delay. All right, so we'll go with Florida. So notice I get nothing printed out to the console, but next time when I select Michigan, notice I got Florida printed out. Again, it's lagging behind by 1 because the moment when I'm trying to console log the state value, this is the old previous value. It's not taking the new value that I'm trying to set immediately because this is asynchronous. React will do it eventually, but not immediately. But eventually when that update does happen, that is when React will automatically go through and render your component again. So React will handle that part. I don't need to worry about that getting out of phase. Andrew Tran, question?
Yeah, this is not related to question, but it does have to do with state abbreviations. If you have sorry, not state abbreviations, like state variables.
Okay.
If you have a lot of state variables and they actually depend on each other, do they cascade down?
If you have a design where I'm going to say this. So it's a great question. You should, for the most part, not have state variables that depend on each other. You should have one piece of data, and then you could do anything you want in your rendering based on that data. So I don't know if you have a particular example. I'm trying to come up with one, but let's say in this case, I have state abbreviation, and then I also want to show like the first letter of my state abbreviation. I'm not going to create a new value and say const state ABVR first letter, because this is kind of just repeat data. I can use this and get what I want instead of creating a new state value. So you, for the most part, you should not have state values that depend on each other. I'm trying to think of a case where that is required, and I'm not going to be able to come up with it on the spot because I suck at winging stuff. But
Maybe like I'm thinking like maybe a card that shows like certain things from the state and like other things from like something completely unrelated, all showing up on one entry at once.
Sorry, could you repeat that? Were you saying a state, like state image?
Yeah, or just like multiple like different state variables combining, and they're just like unrelated, and they combine into a different state variable to show something on the web page.
Okay, I mean, I guess to your base question, no, it's not going to automatically trickle down. So if I have two values that sort of rely on each other, which I guess, again, I don't want to say that's impossible. Like you can maybe have state image that relies on the state abbreviation somehow. So this might be coming from like an API, right? You might have a separate API that you're calling and say, give me the state image. Like I'm not going to create my own images. So I might need to call an API based on what the abbreviation is selected. Yeah, I guess that's a good use case of having two state values, but that is not automatically managed by React. You need to tell React explicitly how these relate to each other. So there's no like internal wiring that says, hey, when this updates, update this right away. You need to explicitly tell React to do that. I guess is the answer to your question. Yeah, interesting thought, interesting question there. In this case, we don't need that extra state value, but always possible that we have multiple state values. All right, so I think this is working. Looks correct. Last thing I want to do is create extra components. Again, this isn't always necessary. This might seem like overkill, but I want to make sure we get practice for it. Let's quickly do that before we wrap up this challenge. So I have all my stuff, all my logic in my app.js. Again, not a lot of code, but I want to get practice creating components. So hopefully you guys will take this extra step when you guys are doing challenges, kind of think about what you can separate out from this app.js. So I'm going to create a new folder. By tradition, I call it components. In here, I'm going to create some new components. So looking at my app.js, I always like separating out user input from user, like output to the user. So I would say this could be one component where we just show the state abbreviation or whatever data we want to show. And that should be independent of how the user is inputting something. Like what if the user wants to type in something or use a dropdown? It shouldn't matter for this part of our logic. This highlighted portion only cares about what data to show. It doesn't care about how the data is getting into the application. So that's why I'm kind of detecting some separation here. So I'm going to create two components in this case. I'm going to go with call it state dropdown.js will be one component. And my other component will be state abbreviation display.js. All right, so we'll create some quick components here just to get more practice. Function name of my component is state dropdown in this case. It's a function. We need to return JSX. And then we also need to export. Don't forget to export your components. Always easy to forget about them. So we're exporting defaults so that anyone can import this component from this file. All right, so we need to relocate some stuff from app.js. So let's get that split screen so I don't have to hop around so much. Split screen, please. All right, so we have app.js on the right here. I want to relocate this portion and put it right here. Oops. All right, again, just my peculiarities. I prefer just having a surrounding div. This adds extra nesting, but in this case, I don't have to have those divs, but I'm just used to it, so I'll do it. All right, we return this dropdown. Again, usually you want to have your event handlers in the same level as your control. So I have my select control right here. So I should probably relocate my event handler, which I had right here. This can be scooped up, put into this file, render, and events. Let's clean this up a bit. We don't need to print this stuff out. We're console logging. We're setting a state. We'll have to worry about that in a bit. Event handlers. All right, so this goes back to design. And we talked about this yesterday. I want to make sure we double up on it. So again, the question is, where should the state value live? And usually the answer is it should live in the most direct ancestor of every component that needs to use that data. So in this case, both my display and my input are going to be interacting with the state value. So you could put the state value in state dropdown, but then state dropdown is going to need to pass that state value up to the parent. The parent needs to pass back down. Doesn't make as much sense rather than just having your parent, in this case, app.js, manage that state value and pass it down to the children as needed. So I'm going to keep the state value here, but we need to access that right here, right? Set state abbreviation is a function that exists in the parent. The child has no access to it. So in this case, let's first import our components. So we have components, import state dropdown. All right, so I replaced the code here. So I'm going to render my state dropdown right here. And now, as we talked about, this child component right here does not have access to state abbreviation. There's no concept of set state abbreviation in this file right now. In order for the parent to give access to this function, we need to pass it down as a prop value. So in this case, state dropdown is our child in relation to app.js. We can pass down a state value as a prop. So in this case, I'm going to pass down set state abbreviation. And that's going to equal set state abbreviation. This is something we talked about, I think, briefly yesterday. I'm just passing down this function directly. This is the updating function. I'm just saying, hey, you can have that updating function directly. In this case, if we are going to do this, we can't print out anything in the console. In this case, my on change handler is going to call props dot set state abbreviation, and then that's all I need. So this is directly, the on change handler is basically going to directly call this updating function. Actually, is that what I want to do? I don't think about it. I guess we could do that, but in that case, we need to take events. T.currentTarget.value. So again, this is a little more code than I had planned, but if we want to just call that directly, we can, but we don't want to pass it the event. We want to pass it the actual text that was selected. So this is an anonymous function, accepts an event object, and then it's going to use that event object to currentTarget.value, and it's going to pass the text value to the state abbreviation. So it's exactly what we're doing right here, right? Where we get an event object and just set the state value from event currentTarget.value. But we're all doing that in just one anonymous function right here. If you guys are cool with that, let me know. If you're not cool with it, also let me know. But we're just creating a function right here and calling it with the event object. So that should update our state abbreviation in our parent, which is app.js. That should automatically trigger any re-rendering as needed. So in this case, I need to relocate this portion to state abbreviation display. So let's do that. Function state abbreviation display. That's a function. Take some props. I think I forgot to add props to my last call. Export default state abbreviation display. We want to return simply what we copied and pasted. So we copied this from app.js. Gonna put this in here. But again, we don't have access to state ABBR, right? That's a state value in the parent. For us to have access to it, the parent needs to pass it down as a prop. So first thing, let's import that new component. Import state abbreviation display. Now that we have that imported, we can use that in our function here. State abbreviation display. But we want to pass down a prop value, right? We want to give it access to some data. So let's call it ABBR equals state ABB abbreviation. So again, you can name these whatever you want. These are just like you're creating variables. This is the actual value you want to pass. In this case, I want to pass the state value as my prop. I'm going to alias that to ABBR. So on this side, I could just do props.abbr. Right, so I'm just matching the name of the prop. That's how I access it through the props object, which I'm capturing right here. All right, and I think I forgot to add props to my other component. Yep, so notice this is not accepting any props. So this is not going to exist in this context. I'll get an error if I try to run this code, because props is not some magical predefined thing. It's just a variable that is capturing props from the parent. And so we name it props by convention, but it can be named anything we want. So in this case, we accept props. Again, this is a bundle up object for all the props that are passed down from our parent to our child. In this case, we have one prop each, but we could theoretically have 12 different props. They will all get bundled into one props object on the child component. Okay, so we have access to props. We are using props in our child components. In one case, we are calling a function back in the parent. In the other case, we're just displaying data that the parent sent us. I want to pause here. I want to make sure we haven't lost anyone. Any questions about using props in this case? Elon.
Do you mind run through the flow for the unchanged part again?
Sure, absolutely. So the flow is the user triggers this event. When they actually change something in the dropdown, a change event happens. So I've created an anonymous function. So this is where we kind of condense some code. Right here, this is a brand new function I'm creating, and that's going to be called when this onChange event happens. One thing I think is worth going over, I want to make sure everyone is crystal clear on what I'm doing right here. So let's create some function. Again, this is not React. This is just for example's sake. So let's just look down here, some function. And let's say I have other function. All right, let's say some function is just going to call other function. All right, I call into this function, it's going to call another function. The distinction that I'm making here is if I actually call some function here, it's going to call other function. Versus if I do what am I trying to do here? So I guess if I do all right, I have two functions here. One is a named function, and the other is an anonymous function. So right here, what I've highlighted, this is a fat arrow function that's going to call other function. Right, so the difference between these two hopefully are apparent. So in one case, I can call a function directly, and this will execute the logic, whatever logic I have here. So this is me calling a function directly. This highlighted portion is the same as if I had this right here, where I have some other function. Let's name it some function. Some function will call other function when we call some function. So in this case, when you create an anonymous function, you are not calling the function right here. You are defining a function. This highlighted portion is the same thing right here. It's defining a new function that will call some other function when this function itself is called. So this portion right here is saying, hey, here's a brand new function. Call it whenever you want to. That's what's being done right here. So that is why fat arrow functions, again, you're defining a function. You're not calling a function right now. So whenever the onChange event happens, it's going to call this function right here for me. That is what this entire thing is doing. This is saying, hey, I'm creating a new function for you, just like this. If you want to imagine I have EVT here, I could create a standalone function and put that name right here, or I could just create this anonymous function right on the spot. Is everyone kind of clear on using anonymous functions in this case? Andrew Tran?
So if it goes down, it calls a function. That function, other function, returns a value. but the function, the anonymous function calling it isn't returning anything yet, right? It's just getting the value from the function that it's calling.
It's not even getting a value, really.
Yeah.
So this right here is equivalent of me creating a function and imagining that it's being stored somewhere. So if I guess I could maybe do a better example here. So if I did event handlers like we did before, I want to do const handle change. Let's just make this a normal function. Function handle change, do something. So I could take in the EVT object here and then call props that whatever. So this is one way I could do it. If I do it this way, I just pass handle change here. So this is one way to do it. I'm just saying call this function. Whenever this function is called, well, it's going to call another function for me. So this is kind of, I'm creating a separate function kind of ahead of time. But the other way I would argue is better because I only have one spot where I need that function to be called from. So I just do it right on that line. I create a function on that line and pass it to onChange. Instead of creating the function beforehand and then passing it to onChange, I could just create that entire function here. So EVT, when this function gets called, what do you want to do? I want to call this function. So that is it's doing the same exact thing as before, but now the advantage of this, again, I don't need to create a separate function that's only used in one place. I create that function kind of in line right here, and it's only used in this case. So it makes sense to create an anonymous function that's used just then and there. I don't know if that kind of sinks in with you guys. Andrew Tran, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I understand. But if the thing did have a return value, it wouldn't be the return value for the original thing calling it. Is what I'm saying, right?
If what had a return value?
You have your anonymous function, it's calling another function. If this function over here has a return value, it's not the return value over here, but because like it'll be the return value for the function that you're calling, but your anonymous function doesn't have to have a return value. It just called the other function is what I'm saying, right?
You still kind of lost me there, but yeah, if this returns
Yeah.
something, it's going to be returned to this function too. In this case, this is not returning anything, right? We're not returning anything from set state abbreviation. This is not returning anything. This just sets a value. Okay, but so we call onChange. It's going to call this function. Should do things for us, and then we want to make sure we do the rest of here. So we have populate state date dropdown. This needs to be relocated too. So I'm going to relocate this. Sean, you have a question?
No, I was just gonna ask, how does it have access to populate state dropdown? But you're doing it right now.
Yeah, I need to relocate that. So since my state dropdown only cares about that data, makes sense to relocate all that. So app does not care about the data at all. So again, this is another reason why we should kind of redesign and create components, because app does not care about that data. Only the dropdown should care about that data. So USA state data can be used here. Hopefully I copy that over. Yeah, okay, I think that should be good. All right, so now our app is much more cleaner. All we have in our app is a state value and the components we kind of want to render. We keep our header around. We don't need to create a separate component for that. We could. Okay, so we have our state value. We're passing the updating function down to the dropdown. We're passing the state data down to the state abbreviation display, both as props. These are props that we're passing down. And then, all right, hopefully everything works. Nothing should change functionally. If I go back to my page, all right, we have an error. All right, so since I relocated my component depth, I need to make sure I find that file correctly. So this is going to be 2 levels up because I'm in my components folder. Components, data. I think that should be good. There we go. All right, so again, I relocated my, components were in another directory, so I needed to, hopefully this goes away. Refresh. All right, cool. Let's try this again. Georgia, great state. GA, that looks appropriate. Rhode Island, nice small state. All right, this is working. I think we spent enough time on this. Before we wrap up, any questions about any of our discussion, understanding why we should break things into components, understand how we do that via passing props to child components so that the child can either call back up to the parent via a function or simply read some data and display some data as it wants to. Jesse?
This is more of a quick question about variables. When you're on if you scroll to the top on the state drop, the USA state data from the data sheet. I'm not quite seeing where that name was created.
You talking about this right here?
Yeah.
That's being literally created right here. Again, this is essentially the equivalent of me doing let USA states data equals some whatever. These are actually dictionaries, so I need to, this is what this file is returning. It's returning an array of dictionaries. I guess I need key value pairs here. But yeah, it's returning dictionaries. So this is like creating a new variable, but we're using import statement because we are getting that data from somewhere else instead of doing let or const.
Okay, thanks. But we can just basically create a variable right there in the import statement.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a good way to think about it. Yeah, so again, we could name this whatever you want and then use that just like a variable, assuming that this is returning, JavaScript data. If this is returning like something else, we need to make sure we understand what the data structure is. In this case, it's a list of dictionaries or list of
All right.
objects.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions before we wrap up this challenge? Andrew, do you still have your hand raised?
I have a different question.
Go for it.
The imports, can you just do it like Python where it's like import star?
I don't think so. I always get confused with imports. Yeah, that's not going to work.
Yeah, I find the imports in like React super confusing for some reason.
Yeah, it takes a while to get used to. Again, I always had to kind of stumble through it sometimes, but you can return more than one item from a file. Again, you can return multiple items. Export default, that returns one main thing, but that thing could be a dictionary. So I think I tried doing this yesterday, but all right, I don't want to prolong this challenge, but again, you're allowed to return more than one item from a file is the short of it. Lyman, you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious, say if we made a design decision to put the state drop down and the state, the display in its own component, would it make sense to put the state in that component versus the app.js?
Yeah, so you're talking about this state value right here, right?
Right.
Yeah, so great discussion point. I definitely want to spend a couple minutes on this. So Lyman's suggestion or question is, well, what if we put the state value right here? This can work, right? In this case, we would need to transmit the state value up to the parent, and the parent would just need to pass it down to here, right? But
so what if we combined the state where instead of so because those two different components, because you broke them into two components, say just for our design sake, we wanted to have that in a single component, would the app.js still need to know that current state?
Are you saying
because those two components are reliant on that, not really necessarily the whole app itself?
Are you saying these two we combine into one component?
Right.
Yeah, if we combine this into one component, then yes, we don't need to have the state value here. The state value can be in that combined component because we're getting the data and showing it in the same component. So yes, in that case, you can relocate this state value in this kind of hybrid combined component. However, with it, the current state, the current, I guess I'm just gonna use state. The current way that this is designed, we need the state value to be on app. And the reason being is because this component right here will need to update anytime this value changes. So there's no way for us to like have the state value here and say, hey, app, here's a new value, automatically re-render.
So I guess the way to think about it is if you have two child components that rely on that state object, that parent component needs to be where you store the state.
Correct. Yeah. So again, the reason there's no such thing as reverse props. So props only go down from parents to children. Children can't provide like reverse props to the parents. And the parent can't say, all right, my reverse props changed, so therefore I can re-render automatically. Again, the whole reason we have state values is so the rendering automatically happens when any of the state values change. In this case, if app has no state values, it's never going to know to re-render the state abbreviation display. Even if the child says, hey, here's some new value, do something with it. App is not, again, the way React works, app will be like, all right, cool, I have a new value. But React's gonna be like, well, that value means nothing to me because your render, you didn't tell me that it's a state value, so therefore I'm not going to update your render for you automatically. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So in this case, yes, since the state value needs to be used by two child components, you want to have the state value in the most direct ancestor of both components. In this case, these are the child components. the parent's managing the state value because both of these need access to some portion of that state value. Jesse?
I just need to understand a little bit more on line 13 on your state dropdown about how on the value, and we're not using string. How are you used to using values? So I'm kind of still a little bit confused on how we're using it in this case versus how I usually see value.
You're right. So let's talk about that. So here you're saying, yeah, usually this is going to be a string. Like this will be, Alabama or Michigan. This is what effectively is going to be stored here. We don't know what this, we can't hard code this, but we are getting that string. So we are getting that string, but it's coming from our data right here. So we are extracting this portion and returning a string from some JavaScript evaluation. So this expression that we wrote, if I can undo these changes. This expression, this is, again, giving a string back. So this is in curly braces, meaning this is JavaScript, but this JavaScript is going to evaluate to a string value. So this, you can imagine, is going to eventually be, Alabama, and that's what value is going to have stored here. So you could write stuff like this. This just means, hey, you have a string in JavaScript and pass that to our JSX. This works. In this case, you don't need curly braces because it's just a string literal. But if you want something evaluated as JavaScript, you need to add those curly braces. So it's going to say, look in our array, find that dictionary, and find me the alpha 2 value. So if I look, if I go to my data, I'm like, all right, cool, we selected Michigan. What's the alpha 2 value for it? Well, it's MI, so that's what's returned from that lookup. So we are storing a string in the value. It's just we had to go through our data dictionary or our data objects to get it.
Okay, I think I'm seeing it because I usually see that in the console area. So, okay, yep, thanks.
Cool. All right, I think we probably spent enough time on this challenge. Hopefully that was informative. Again, if there's any lingering questions, we'll definitely make some time, maybe during lecture, to kind of go over any concepts that we're unfamiliar here. So I will commit this and do a pull request, but let's stop the recording here.